Something survived the flood, and it wasn't Noah, his family, or the animals we think we know so well. A truth is buried in the oldest texts in the world that no one has wanted to explain openly. The canonical texts state that the waters swept everything away, but the apocryphal ones tell a different story. The Book of Enoch, suppressed for centuries, describes beings that could not die in the same way as humans. Those beings were the Nephilim, sons of the fallen angels and the women of the earth before the Great Flood. The question that scholars avoid is a single one. Why are there documented giants after the flood? Genesis chapter 6 mentions them before the event, but Numbers 13 names them again much later. If the flood eliminated all flesh on earth, how is it possible for the giants to reappear clearly? The official response proposes a second fall of angels, but that explanation does not convince any researcher. There is a documented possibility in apocryphal fragments that the official history prefers to keep silent. To understand this possibility, we must go back to a civilization that preceded the great universal flood. The era before the flood was not primitive. It was a time of unparalleled technological and spiritual dominance in history. The Watchers passed on to their children a knowledge that the canonical texts chose to bury under centuries of silence. The texts of Enoch describe an era when the Watchers, angels who descended to Mount Hermon, dominated everything. Those beings transmitted to humanity knowledge of metallurgy, astronomy, enchantments, and eternal architecture. His children, the Nephilim, were giants in body and mind, bearers of knowledge that humans could not possess. But the Book of Jubilees adds something that almost no one mentions. The Nephilim were not all identical to one another. There were clear hierarchies among them, structures of power, and some possessed unique architectural knowledge. Plato, centuries later, described an advanced island civilization that disappeared beneath the ocean in a day. She called it Atlantis and claimed that its inhabitants mastered technology and structures that the world had never seen. But Plato did not invent that story. He received it directly from Egyptian priests in size with ancient archives. Those priests claimed that the destruction of Atlantis occurred 9,000 years before the Greek legislator Solon. However, some researchers point out a chronological coincidence with the flood that is impossible to completely ignore. And the connection between Atlantis and the Nephilim is not speculative. Both sources describe the same reality. Researchers who have compared both traditions find coincidences that are impossible to completely ignore. What if Atlantis was not an Atlantic island, but the name the Egyptians gave to the entire antediluvian world? What if the builders of Atlantis were precisely the Nephilim, direct descendants of the angels from Genesis? The Book of Enoch describes cities built by the Watchers with materials that no natural agent can destroy. Describes structures carved into the living rock of the highest mountains, inaccessible to any ordinary man. But there is a detail that no one connects with the flood: the extreme height of those apocryphal constructions described. The peaks of Ararat, Hermon, and Sinai appear in the apocryphal texts as strategic sacred retreat places. Mount Hermon is mentioned as the original point of descent of the 200 fallen Watchers from heaven. That mountain exceeds 2,800 meters, an elevation that no regional flood could ever reach. Did the Nephilim build deliberate shelters in those heights before the waters of judgment came down? The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, contains a very disturbing revelation. Describe the Nephilim receiving prophetic dreams that precisely announced an imminent destruction of the heavens. But unlike Noah, who built a floating ark, some of them made a radically different decision. According to those fragments, a group of Nephilim decided not to flee to the heights, but to descend into the depths. The texts describe chambers beneath the mountains and the seabed, sealed with knowledge inherited from their parents. This matches the descriptions of Atlantis, where there were underground channels and completely sacred chambers. Plato described temples of ivory, walls of precious metal, and foundations that penetrated deeply into the solid ground. However, the most revealing aspect is his mention of tunnels that connected all the regions of the great legendary island. Those tunnels, according to the Egyptian priests who informed Solon, were designed to withstand aquatic disasters. The image that emerges is not that of a destroyed civilization, but rather one that prepared itself with time and knowledge. Some of its inhabitants, those of angelic lineage, would have anticipated the flood with absolute precision. Why couldn't the flood destroy structures built on the highest peaks of the known world at that time? The answer lies within the biblical texts themselves, which are read too quickly to notice their most revealing details. Genesis states that the waters covered the mountains 15 cubits above their tops, according to the standard version. But scholars of biblical Hebrew point out that this measure may refer only to the local level of the eastern Mediterranean. A catastrophic regional flood, like the one proposed for the Black Sea, would never have covered Mount Hermon. If Hermon was not submerged, the structures that the Nephilim built there would still be intact today. But there is a more unsettling possibility that arises from apocryphal Syriac fragments and very ancient Ethiopian sources. Those fragments describe Nephilim who knew the art of existing underwater, a knowledge inherited directly from their parents. The Watchers were not beings of ordinary flesh. They were entities of a spiritual nature that adopted a corporeal form. And his knowledge included, according to the Book of Enoch, chapter 60-5, complete mastery over the four elements. Then their purest descendants, those who retained a greater proportion of the angelic lineage, managed to survive. Not because the water could not reach them, but because the nature of water could not destroy what existed within them. This explains why Numbers 13 describes giants in Canaan centuries after the great flood that wiped out the earth. The Anations, the sons of Anak, are presented as beings so enormous that the Israelite spies seemed like locusts. But if the flood had been total and universal, where did these colossi that inhabited walled cities come from? Rabbinic tradition has an answer that is rarely mentioned outside of the more specialized study circles. The Babylonian Talmud mentions Og, the mighty king of Bashan, as a direct survivor of the Great Flood. He would have survived clinging to the outside of Noah's Ark, floating on the terrible waters for 150 days. But that explanation always seemed insufficient to account for the magnitude and historical persistence of the giants. There is another tradition in Ethiopian sources and in the Book of Jubilees that offers a much more complete picture. According to that tradition, the spirits of the Nephilim who perished in the flood did not disappear, but became demons. But their genetic lineage persisted in those who managed to take refuge in time before the great waters arrived. And that refuge, according to the apocryphal texts, was both physical and spiritual, chambers in the rock sealed with power. The idea of protective seals against water is not just a metaphor. Modern engineers recognize and validate it. Mycenaean structures, the pyramids of Egypt, and Göbekli Tepe exhibit truly remarkable sealing techniques. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried 11,000 years ago, just before the flood period that the texts suggest. Someone decided to preserve that structure by covering it with earth, as if anticipating that something devastating was approaching. The archaeologists who excavated Göbekli Tepe confirmed that it was intentionally buried, not by the passage of time. That deliberate burial is one of the great mysteries of modern archaeology, with no satisfactory answer. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Anatolia, less than 300 kilometers in a straight line from Mount Ararat. The same region where biblical and apocryphal texts concentrate almost all the central narrative about the flood. But the most revealing case of all is not in the heights, but in the very depths of the earth beneath our feet. However, underground structures may be more revealing than those built in the mountainous heights. Beneath the city of Derinkuyu, in Cappadocia, there is an underground city capable of housing more than 20,000 people. It was excavated in volcanic rock up to 60 meters deep, with 18 well-defined habitable levels. Archaeologists have not definitively determined who built it or in what exact period it was first excavated. The deeper layers show techniques that differ radically from the upper, more recent and better-known ones. Was Derinkuyu built as a refuge against a flood of water or against some even more terrible and global catastrophe? The Hittite documents about underground structures in that area explicitly refer to superhuman ancestors. Derinkuyu is not alone. There are more than 200 documented underground cities just in the Cappadocia region. That density of underground structures in a single region suggests a collective planning of a civilizational scale. Cappadocia is not the only place with architectural anomalies of uncertain origin and colossal scale without explanation. Under the Black Sea, researcher Robert Ballard found structures that clearly date back to before the Great Flood. The structures discovered by Ballard raise questions that conventional archaeology has been unable to answer. Who inhabited the shores of the ancient freshwater lake that we now call the Black Sea before the flood submerged it? Those structures, at 90 meters deep, include what appear to be foundations of rectangular buildings. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake before the Mediterranean flooded it, about 7,000 years ago. That event, which many researchers identify with the biblical flood, occurred with extreme speed and violence. The structures at their core were not destroyed by the waters. They simply remained submerged and perfectly intact. Intact as if their builders had used materials and techniques designed to withstand precisely that event. The image is that of a civilization that knew its fate in advance and acted accordingly with full determination. A civilization not entirely human, bearer of angelic knowledge that was built to withstand eternity. The Book of Enoch tells that the Watchers taught the Nephilim the art of cutting stone with maximum precision. That technique appears in Egypt, in the Andes, in Malta, and in pre-dynastic Turkey, without any known explanation. The blocks of Sacsayhuaman weigh up to 125 tons and are cut with millimeter precision. No technology from the estimated period for its construction can explain that astonishing level of perfect accuracy. That same construction pattern appears in Pumapunku in Bolivia, where the blocks show cuts that defy all logic. The geographical distribution of these techniques spans 5 continents, as if the same master had taught everyone. But if they were built by heirs of the knowledge of the Watchers, then everything fits together coherently. And if some of those beings survived in high shelters or underwater chambers, they reappeared without any problem. They reappeared in Canaan as the Anakim, in Bashan as the Rephaim, and in Gaza as the descendants of the mighty Anak. Each group is described in the Hebrew texts with terms that clearly imply superhuman stature and strength. What few connect is that those groups lived exactly in the geographical areas of the apocryphal refuges described. The Rephaim inhabited the region of Hermon, the same mountain where the Watchers descended according to the Book of Enoch. The Anasians controlled Hebron and the mountains of Judah, regions of extremely high elevations in the ancient Canaanite corridor. And the Philistines of Gaza, where Goliath lived, controlled the coast over the tectonic platform of the deep Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth, surrounds a region that shows evident signs of violent catastrophe. Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by fire according to Genesis, correspond to geological events of sudden soil fusion. But that is another distinct mystery. Let's return to how the giants managed to persist beyond the Great Flood. There is a text that is rarely cited in this specific context, and that completely changes the perspective on the subject. The Book of Baruch, a 1st century Jewish apocryphal text, describes angelic messengers who guard sealed structures. Those structures are repositories of knowledge and life, carefully sealed before the Great Flood. The Hebrew term to describe them also means ark, but of a radically different nature than that of Noah. Not a floating ark, but a static ark, buried or submerged, built to withstand from within. The narrative of the flood that we know could be just the part of the story that suited the canonical tradition. The other part, in the Apocrypha, in the Qumran fragments, and in the Ethiopian traditions of Enoch, reveals much more. It is said that not everyone who was supposed to die in the flood died, and that not everyone survived in a floating ark. Some did it through means that the official texts could not include, without questioning the entire coherence of the narrative. The deeper problem is not theological, but historical. If some Nephilim survived, where is the evidence? The most compelling evidence is in the very texts that state that the flood destroyed absolutely everything alive. Because those texts, in their following chapters, present living, active, and organized giants without any explanation. That internal contradiction cannot be resolved without accepting that something fundamental in the canonical narrative was edited or omitted. And the hypothesis of the apocryphal refuges, whether in heights or depths, elegantly resolves that contradiction. But there is something more that adds weight to this. Modern geology and oceanography support part of that described scenario. The Caucasus, Zagros, and Taurus mountain ranges form an arc that completely encircles the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. That region was the heart of the Antediluvian world, according to the geography outlined in the early chapters of Genesis. And it has the highest elevations in the entire Near East, some of which clearly exceed 5,000 meters. No regional flood model, not even the most catastrophic proposed by science, would completely cover those peaks. So the shelters at those heights, if they existed as the apocryphal texts describe, would have survived without problems. And its occupants, beings of a partially angelic nature as described in detail in the Book of Enoch, survived. A final element connects all of this with Atlantis in a way that academia has not yet officially formalized. And Plato does not use the word myth to describe Atlantis. He uses the word history and explicitly affirms its truthfulness. That linguistic nuance, which critics often overlook, radically changes the weight we should give to the narrative. Plato describes the Atlanteans as direct descendants of the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. That description is identical in structure to that of the Nephilim, children of superior beings and women of the earth. Poseidon, in archaic Greek mythology, was the lord of the deep seas and the highest mountains. It precisely controlled the two types of refuge that the apocryphal texts attribute to the surviving Nephilim. the mountains of Hermon where the Watchers descended, and the depths where they built their chambers of preservation. So Atlantis and the world of the Nephilim are not two separate mysteries, but a single mystery of two cultures. The Greek tradition called it Atlantis and placed it in the sea. The Hebrew tradition called it the Antediluvian world. But both describe the same catastrophe, the same semi-divine beings, and the same massive destruction by cold water. And both suggest, without stating it explicitly, that something from that world managed to persist beyond the destructive event. The priests of Sais told Solon that they kept records of what existed before Atlantis disappeared. How did they have those records if everything was destroyed? Someone must have survived to pass them on to future generations. And that someone, according to the internal logic of both traditions, was a being who knew the supreme art of preserving oneself. The Nephilim, who erected shelters in the heights or in the depths, bearers of eternal angelic knowledge. But then the question arises that changes everything we think we know. Does any lineage of those beings still persist today? Apocryphal texts do not provide a direct answer, but they also do not definitively or absolutely close that door. The Book of Enoch describes spirits of the Nephilim wandering the earth in search of bodies, never completely extinct. And the New Testament, when speaking of the days of Noah, suggests that those conditions will return before the end times. Setting aside eschatology, the historical and archaeological record tells its own deeply disturbing story. The traditions of surviving giants appear in cultures that had no contact with each other for millennia. The Caucasian Nats, the Hebrew Anakim, and the Ethiopian Nephilim from the Book of Enoch all tell exactly the same story. Everyone describes beings of superhuman stature that inhabited the earth after a great global aquatic destruction. They all locate them in high mountain areas or in regions close to large bodies of deep and absolutely dark water. And they all agree that those beings held a knowledge that no ordinary human could replicate or understand. Each new excavation in the Near East adds fragments that fit better with the apocryphal texts than with the canon. And each new search in the ocean depths finds structures that the official narrative does not know how to classify. The story we were taught is incomplete, and the biggest gaps are precisely where the apocryphal texts shed their light. The question is no longer whether the Nephilim survived the Great Flood, but how exactly they did it and where they went. The most coherent response points to a network of strategically distributed shelters before the Great Judgment arrived. Shelters on the peaks of Hermon and Ararat, and also in sealed chambers beneath the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The truth that the apocryphal texts hold is that the flood was not the end of the Nephilim, but their transformation. Some died and their spirits became demons, but others persisted in shelters that the water could not overcome. From those shelters emerged the giants of Canaan, the kings of Bashan, and the bearers of the knowledge of Atlantis. Subscribe and activate the bell. Every week we reveal what the official texts decided never to tell you.